and welcome to today's lecture on the ancient city of Hierakonpolis. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to talk about one of the most important towns in the earliest days of Egypt. This is our first attempt at an ancient Egyptian site-based approach, and our goal here is to investigate how looking at a singular place within the ancient Egyptian landscape can illuminate all sorts of information about religion and politics and culture that's all going on in the earliest days of ancient Egypt. Oh, and anytime you're excavating a place called the City of the Falcon, you know it's going to be awesome. So whether you want to build a great temple or you'd rather construct a grand palace, why not do both and journey with me as we investigate Hierakonpolis, City of the Falcon.
When we talk about the city of Hierakonpolis, we're very literally talking about the city of the Falcon. It was located in the south, in Upper Egypt, just south of the bend in the river where Karnak and Luxor and Thebes would later thrive. This was the ancient Greek name for the town. And in ancient Greek, Hierax translates as falcon, while polis translates as city. The ancient Egyptian name for the town was Nekhen, which sounds nothing like Hierakonpolis. So how in the world do these names evolve? And why are we talking about falcons to begin with?
Well, in the ancient Egyptian language, the town's name of Nekhen referred to a small local falcon god called Nekhen. As the city grew, however, this falcon god merged with Horus, another falcon god. And as Egyptian history unfolds, it turns out that Horus becomes one of the main gods in the Egyptian pantheon. But even though he's depicted as a falcon, it doesn't mean that he's the god of birds or falcons or hawks or anything like that. Instead, Horus is the patron god of kingship.
One of the most important myths in Egyptian religion is that of the death of Osiris and the rise of Horus. Osiris originally was the king of the gods and the living, but soon his brother Set got jealous. Set tricked Osiris, captured him, and chopped him into pieces and scattered his dismembered body across the land. Osiris's devoted sister Isis, however, went around, gathered the parts, and put Osiris back together. They then made love, which is disturbing for all kinds of reasons, and their son Horus was born.
Now, once he came of age, Horus challenged Set to an epic battle, and after a prolonged struggle, he was eventually able to defeat his evil uncle. Horus took the role of the god of the living, specifically the god of kingship, while Osiris stayed down below, becoming the god of the underworld and the god of the dead. Now, some scholars argue that through the reconstitution of Osiris, we get the story of the origin of the Egyptian process of mummification.
Let's get back to the city of the Falcon, Hierakonpolis. Hierakonpolis didn't just have a temple to the falcon god Horus, it had the earliest temple in all of ancient Egypt. This religious structure dates back long before Egypt was ever unified, to the middle of the 4th millennium BCE. And its structure was less of a temple and more of an open-air sanctuary. There was a large oval courtyard about 100 feet long, and a deep pit suggests there was once a tall pole, likely topped with a statue of the falcon god Horus.
Now, the main shrine of the temple was fronted by 4 giant wooden posts. You have to remember that the town was still pretty small at this point, so this structure here would have towered over not only the sanctuary, but the entire town itself. Now, archaeological remains suggest that there were brightly colored reeds or textiles that were used on the walls. Some archaeologists even think that the roof itself would have been curved to resemble the look of a mummified falcon.
A small mound of dirt or mud brick inside the courtyard represented the primordial mound from which all life arose. We see this sort of symbolism all over the place in ancient Egypt, most prominently, of course, with the pyramids. Egyptologists have debated whether this mound would have also served as the seat of power for the current ruler, an elevated platform from which he could observe the sacrifices to the gods.
So the earliest temple in all of Egypt was dedicated to the falcon god Horus at the site of Hierakonpolis. Over time, this eventually fell out of use, and a new temple was built. This one centered on a large mound of clean sand. The symbolism of the primordial mound comes through once again.
The site of Hierakonpolis was excavated in 1897 and 1898 by James Quibell and Frederick Green, 2 English archaeologists. And while their heart might have been in the right place, their methods aren't exactly what we'd call meticulous and cutting edge in the modern world of archaeology. Rather than excavate layer by layer like modern archaeologists do, they dig down and give massive groups of objects titles like main deposit or subsidiary deposit, with little and sometimes inaccurate spatial information. Modern archaeologists would tend to highlight just how much we can learn from that spatial information and the relationships between objects. But there's not much to go on from Quibell and Green's 19th century excavations.
Nevertheless, the artifacts they excavated at Hierakonpolis were so impressively stunning that the iconographic information from the objects themselves can provide quite a lot of information. Most famous of all, it was here at Hierakonpolis that the Narmer palette, perhaps the most important artifact regarding the founding of a unified Egypt, was discovered here. Now the palette, as we've seen, shows King Narmer in the white crown on one side, and then on the back side we can see the same king in the red crown, conquering his foes and perhaps uniting all of ancient Egypt.
But it wasn't just the palette. Alongside this invaluable artifact in the main deposit at Hierakonpolis, Quibell and Green unearthed the Scorpion mace head, showing King Scorpion undertaking an irrigation project. They also dug up the Narmer mace head, showing King Narmer in the red crown of Lower Egypt, receiving captives and booty from his conquests.
Taken together, the earliest temple of Horus, the Narmer palette, and the Scorpion and Narmer mace heads, most scholars believe that Hierakonpolis was the first capital of Upper Egypt. And eventually, after the conquests of Narmer, it likely became the first capital of a united Egypt.
We've already seen that the site of Hierakonpolis has the earliest temple in all of Egypt. But that's just one of the famous firsts it can boast. Hierakonpolis was also the earliest painted tomb in all of Egypt. It dates back sometime between 3500 and 3200 BCE, well before the unification process got underway. And the images in this painting show an interesting combination of Egyptian motifs that will last for centuries to come, and Mesopotamian motifs that seem borrowed from abroad.
So, on the Egyptian side of things, we see some of the conventions for the depiction of people. Men seated, women worshiping, that sort of thing. On the Mesopotamian side of things, we get the Mesopotamian style reed boats. We see a woman, likely a priestess, holding two standing lionesses. And we get the depiction of some of the animals frequently associated and depicted within Mesopotamian art. What's important here is that this shows that from the earliest days, even before Egypt was unified, we get at least some connection between Egyptian civilization based in the Nile River Valley and Mesopotamian civilization based in the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys.
The other impressive first from Hierakonpolis is the discovery of a zoo or menagerie. Only discovered recently, 2009 to be exact. Archaeologists believe that they have unearthed the remnants of an enclosure that contained a huge variety of animals. Hippopotamuses and elephants, baboons and leopards, crocodiles and hartebeests, also known as African antelopes, would have been contained within this enclosure and are now represented by their skeletal remains.
Now, part of this was certainly for the amusement of the ruler of Hierakonpolis. But a zoo like this would have also conveyed a very important message. The king is able to subdue the powerful forces of nature. He's able to collect animals that many people may have never seen before and rule over them like he rules over chaos and disorder. It's a symbolic action that demonstrates to his people that he should be in charge because he's so powerful he can bring the mighty chaotic hippopotamus under his control. Now, weird side note here. Manetho's King Menes was said to have been killed by a hippopotamus. So maybe we're looking at the remains of the hippo that killed the first ruler of a unified Egypt.
One of the most imposing structures at the site of Hierakonpolis is a massive mud brick structure dating to the reign of King Khasekhemwy of the Second Dynasty. He was the last king of the early dynastic period, in fact. This rectangular structure is absolutely massive for its time, 220 feet long by 185 feet wide. It had walls that were 16 feet thick, and part of the structure is still preserved all the way up to its original height, 32 feet tall.
Now, scholars usually call this structure the Fort of Khasekhemwy. But in reality, no one really knows what this thing was used for. It looks somewhat like a funerary complex, something a king would build for all the rituals to take place after he's died. But the problem with that interpretation is that King Khasekhemwy already has a funerary complex, that one at the site of Abydos where he's actually buried.
Some Egyptologists think that Khasekhemwy's two massive enclosures are signs that he eventually moved the capital from Hierakonpolis to Abydos. Basically, he started his funerary complex at Hierakonpolis, and that's what we're looking at here, and then he moved the capital to Abydos to start a new one. Other Egyptologists have all kinds of problems with this theory because there appear to be multiple phases of construction at the Hierakonpolis enclosure, indicating it was worked on even after the start of the Abydos enclosure. Either way, this massive structure shows the limits of archaeological remains. Even massive monuments are often difficult to interpret.
What is clear is that Khasekhemwy's massive enclosures, both at Hierakonpolis and at Abydos, signal a new phase in the scale of royal construction. Khasekhemwy was the last king of the Second Dynasty, and by Dynasty 3, massive enclosures like this have evolved into Egypt's very first pyramids. But that's a story for another day. The site of Hierakonpolis is fascinating, both because it played such a monumental role in the earliest days of Egypt, and because it fell mostly out of use for the rest of Egypt's history. It has Egypt's very first temple, it's got Egypt's very first painted tomb, and it's got Egypt's very first zoo. And undoubtedly, it's got some of the most important artifacts that tell us about the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And the scale of structures, like Khasekhemwy's fort, portend the glory of architecture yet to come. We can see at Hierakonpolis the delicate balance between religion and politics, and between art and architecture. And here we get the symbolism of power and control that the kings of early Egypt desired to convey. Just a few lessons you can learn from
Hierakonpolis, City of the Falcon.